Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian. I'm here today at the Rock Island Auction Company. I'm taking a look at some of the guns that are coming up for sale in their September of 2016 premiere auction. And we've got a really interesting and very unusual semi-auto pre-World War II military rifle here. Well, a prototype military rifle. Czechoslovakia, like pretty much every other country in the world with a significant military or a developing military, between World War I and II, spent a lot of time experimenting and developing semi-automatic rifles. Pretty much everyone in the world wanted one. Pretty much nobody in the world was willing to pay for one. And there was still a lot of development process going on to try and figure out how to make these rifles reliable and light enough and strong enough and how to make them work. So the US and Russia were really the two countries that came up with good products, the Tokarev rifle and the Garand rifle. But there's a lot of experimentation going on elsewhere, especially in Czechoslovakia. There are two particularly large factories there, one in Brno, there was also the CZ factory, and they both spent a lot of time competing back and forth in Czech military testing. Now, one of the more notable Czech rifles of this period was the ZH-29, developed by Emanuel Holek, and that was manufactured by the factory in Brno. It had a lot of things going for it. It was a quite elegant design. It was remarkably light for its caliber and yet also strong and functional. It was tested by a great many countries. It was actually purchased in small number by a handful. We've done some other video on the ZH-29. Well, the Czech government spent basically all of the 1930s experimenting with these rifles. And not just the ZH-29, but then developmental versions of it, the 32, 37. In fact, 1937 was one of the larger, 37 and 38, was one of the larger sets of Czech military trials. The Brno factory, of course, had this evolved version of the ZH-29. The CZ factory went back to the drawing board kind of and came up with its own rifle to compete, and that was this one. This is a CZ model of 1937. It's an 8mm Mauser. It's a semi-auto rifle. It uses a tilting bolt, very much like the ZB-26 light machine gun or the Bren gun that would develop from it. We'll take a look at that in a moment. And it has a short stroke gas piston to run the action. And it's really a pretty complicated gun. I have very little information on how this did in testing. Best I can tell, it was reasonably well liked, but it didn't perform well in harsh conditions, for example, mud. Just looking at it, I probably could have predicted that at the time. But it's got some interesting features to it. They clearly wanted this to operate like a bolt-action rifle, sort of. The Germans did the same thing with the G41 trials process. So there's a bolt handle on here, but in order to use it, you have to actually lift it up, kind of like you would unlock a rifle bolt. Then you can cycle it back, forward, and then lock it down to actually shoot. So kind of an interesting idea there. Fortunately for everyone who ever had to use one of these rifles, that didn't go anywhere. Anyway, the 1937-1938 trials didn't produce a real winner. They kind of went, well, you know, these are okay, but we really want something better than any of the rifles in this competition. What's interesting is the rifle that ultimately was designed as a result actually had an annular gas piston. That is to say, a gas piston that's actually wrapped around the barrel instead of operating above or below it. And nothing was ever produced before World War II because World War II got in the way. But it's interesting to note that after World War II, the next semi-auto rifle adopted by Czechoslovakia was the CZ-52 or VZ-52 rifle, which still had that annular gas piston. So it's interesting. It seems like that concept kind of stayed right there in a holding pattern through the war until they were able to continue it after the war. Anyway, why don't we go ahead and take this thing apart. I don't really have any other information for you on its trials history or anything else. It's really a dead end of a design. And man, it's kind of a hot mess to take apart. You'll see that. All right, so this is a semi-automatic rifle, but it does have a fixed box magazine, 10 rounds there. It's chambered for 8mm Mauser, which was the standard Czech Army cartridge of the time. We have a pretty standard rear sight here, goes out to 2,000 meters. The safety is located on the back of the action. This is the fire position. Flip it up for the safe position. This other lever is for disassembly, so we'll get to that in a moment. Trigger, of course. And then the bolt handle is kind of one of the weird features of this. Now, they wanted it to duplicate the action of a bolt-action Mauser, because that's what the troops had and were used to. So, in order to use it, you grab the handle, lift it up. That's going to lock your top cover into your bolt instead of into the receiver. Then you can cycle the bolt open. Now this does lock open on an empty magazine. Once it's locked open, this top cover slides freely in its rails, which is important because your stripper clip guide is actually on the top cover. So the bolt's sitting back here, but you have to have the top cover closed to load it via stripper clip. Now when you do, the follower will actually depress down into the gun. When the follower depresses, it actually releases the bolt locking catch. So the bolt is now free to move, sort of. It's now being held actually by the trigger. Now, this was a feature kind of common to, well, it was on the ZH-29 and a number of other prototype rifles of this vintage. You don't actually have a bolt release lever. You'll see there's nothing here. There's nothing on the other side of the receiver here. In order to drop the bolt, you pull the trigger. And the ideal was that simplifies the action. That's one less control to deal with. And it's kind of a natural thing. You reload the gun and you start pulling the trigger. It's something that would be considered kind of horrifically unsafe today, but that's how you would run the gun at the time. So anyway, close the bolt, lock it down, reload with your two stripper clips. That depresses the follower, and now when I pull the trigger, the bolt drops shut. So one interesting feature to note here is when I lift up the bolt, what I'm doing is locking this top cover onto the bolt itself. Now you'll see when I lift this, it's going to cam the bolt back just slightly, like that. That's an important safety feature because this moves the bolt slightly out of battery, which prevents you from firing it with the handle up. If you were to do that, because the bolt and the top cover are now locked together, if you fired it, or if you were able to fire it, this top cover would come flying back at the shooter, and that would be a bad thing. So you have to have the bolt handle down. That locks the top cover into the receiver so that it can't move and allows the bolt to travel freely underneath it. All right, we're going to start at the back here for disassembly with this lever. I have to depress this pin. We got part of my universal disassembly tool here. Just depress that. Then I can rotate this lever, and I want it to go all the way around like that. And then this piece comes out. So this is basically the rear plug of the receiver with a pair of spring guide rods. With that guy out, we can now pull out the pair of main springs, which I've hooked together. There we go. Now, this whole assembly comes out the back of the gun. So I can take the top cover off, set that aside, and then we've got a bolt and bolt carrier here, which come off, and then they come apart kind of like an FAL. So this is a tilting bolt. You can see we've got this classic Czech style hook on the bolt, which is going to latch into a little section on the top of the bolt carrier. So when I put this in, if I can get it back in, there we go. So this is the unlocked position with the bolt up. When it's locked, the bolt face gets pushed back, the whole bolt tilts down, and now this surface right here on the bolt locks into the receiver. Specifically, this surface right here, that's the locking shoulder. Works like a FAL, works like an SVT. This is pretty common, pretty standard of tilting bolt actions. So that drops down in right about that configuration. Then, when the action cycles, this bolt carrier starts to move backward. It has a curved surface right up in here that grabs the hook on the bolt. That pulls the back surface of the bolt up. The whole thing reconfigures like this, and then it can go backwards to cycle. So there's that hook. You can also see a hook like that in the STG-44, actually, which would come much later than this. So that hook grabs it, and that just simply acts to pull the bolt up or allow it to drop down. Now the front end here is also kind of interesting. It's actually impressive how far we can disassemble this. So the first bit is we've actually got this little wire spring retainer. What I have to do is push this inwards and then rotate the front sling swivel, and that's going to unlock this metal handguard. So push that in, Then I can rotate that. We'll go 180 degrees, and then this slides forward. There we go. Now with this metal handguard forward, the upper and lower wooden handguards are loose, and I can just pull them off. So we've got those out of the way. Now we can see our gas piston here, which is going to cycle backwards like this. All right, I think I'm doing this out of order of the official disassembly procedure, but I'm going to go to the front sight block and gas block next. I have this lever, which rotates up. That unlocks this front sight block, which I can pull off. You can see the gas piston is in there. So now our front sight block and gas block come off, along with their retaining lever lock. So this is the gas block. We have a hole drilled from there down into here. There's a hole in the barrel to match. Let's see. There it is, right there. So gas comes out that hole, down into the gas block there, into this small area, which then pushes back on the gas piston. So I'm going to leave the handguard on here for the time being. There's really nothing special there. It's just a sheet metal piece. It's being retained by the sling swivel, which rotates, and it's also being retained by this wire spring, which is kind of a pain in the butt to take out. So we'll leave that alone. All right, before we can take this out, I'm going to take the magazine out. This works just like a Mauser magazine. Push the button in, pull that back. There's the magazine. Then I want to take this cover piece off, so we have another spring-loaded detent right there. Push that in, and then, there we go. I can pull this piece off. Once that's off, then I can take out this block with its return spring. Okay, this piece, this may get a little bit trickier to explain and get a good camera angle on, but this piece sits here and it just moves slightly back and forward. It's got its own return spring here, and it's connected to the gas piston at this end, right there. Then it's got these two arms that are going to come up in the receiver. So the arms come up to around here, and they are going to push on the bolt carrier when the gas piston cycles backwards. So if we look at this from the top, you can see that one of those arms right there coming backwards. When the bolt is all the way forward, this piece and the bolt are in direct contact. So it's a short stroke piston, which is going to push this guy down here backward. That throws the bolt backward its first bit, and then the residual inertial energy from that pushes it all the way back to cycle. So we know that this didn't do well in testing in harsh conditions, and perhaps even more importantly than that, this would be a ridiculously expensive rifle to manufacture. There are a lot of really complex parts involved in this thing. I mean, this piece is not trivial. This piece is just, dear Lord. This one's not as bad, but you've still got square cuts, round cuts, cuts on all sorts of sides. You've got the bolt handle to do with a bunch of intricate pieces to it. This thing, this would be an incredibly expensive gun to actually adopt. So even if it had done really well in trials, there's no way the Czechs would have adopted this thing. Well, thank you for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. It's a neat rifle. Boy, I can see why it didn't get adopted for a couple of different reasons. Interesting just how far you can take this thing apart. Normally things like the front sight are actually pinned in place and not easily removable. So definitely a neat one to take a look at. If you'd like to own it yourself, get really good at that disassembly process, I suppose, take a look at the description text below. You'll find a link there to Rock Island's catalog page on the rifle, where you can take a look at their pictures and description and place a bid online or over the phone, or come up here to Rock Island and participate in their auction live. Thanks for watching.